Hi, everyone, and happy Friday. I'm Emily Hickmott with the Van Buren Conservation District, and I want to welcome you all to the last day of our second Backyard Symposium. We've got Garrett Heator here today to talk about the introduction to permaculture. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes and then I'm going to hand it over to Garrett. So just bear with me if you would. We'll do a little bit of housekeeping. First off, we're just really excited that you all are here with us today. We really believe at the district that the more that we're able to connect with the land and connect with each other, the healthier we will be as individuals, the healthier our communities will be, and the healthier our planet will be. So thank you for taking the time to take in this information and see how you can apply it in your own lives and in your own backyards. Just to get started on our housekeeping, a little bit of how Zoom works, whether you're familiar or not, we'll go through this. You can go ahead and if you have any issues throughout, you can feel free to message us using our contact form on our website. That's for general questions. It's at vanburencd.org/contact-2/, or while you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter using the subscribe option at the bottom of our website. Now, just so you all know, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available for public use at our YouTube channel, which is www.youtube.com/user/vanburencd/videos. You can also follow us on Facebook at Van Buren CD. During the course of this webinar, we also have live captioning available, which you can turn on in the bottom control panel, the black bar towards the bottom. It's a closed caption option. If those are distracting, you can also turn those off. Now, as I said earlier, if you have questions, you can use our contact form for general things, but if it's over the course of this webinar and you want to ask Garrett a question or you're having technical difficulties, feel free to click on the Q&A icon in that black bar towards the bottom of your screen again, and you can submit a question. Towards the end of the presentation, Garrett's going to leave a little bit of time, about 10 minutes or so, depending on how much he gets into his presentation, and we'll have time to ask questions. You can submit that question using the send button once you've typed it out, and I can ask those of Garrett. Additionally, if you need further help, use the chat function, which is again in that bottom bar. You can reach out directly to the VBCD moderator, or in parentheses help, instead of messaging everyone if that's easier for you, and we can get you all straightened out. You can also feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, say hi, let us know where you're joining from, and we'll get started. So that's all that I have for housekeeping. Very quickly, I want to introduce Garrett and then I will turn it over to him. So Garrett grew up with 4 generations of family, helping his great-grandparents tend and harvest a garden that stocked their pantry through the Michigan winters. As he learned more about the environmental problems people are causing, he was compelled to become more of a producer than a consumer, and to do so in a way that stewards the land and that provides for us. By day, he's a middle school teacher, and on nights and weekends, he works on his 1,000 tree orchard, expanding trees and perennials available for nursery sales, and growing and processing dried herbs for teas and hemp for CBD products. Sounds like Garrett keeps very busy, so we really appreciate him taking this time to be with us. And with that, I will stop sharing and let Garrett get started.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Can you see my screen okay?
Not yet, Garrett.
All right, let me share that. How about now?
That's great. Yep, we're all set. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming, everyone who's here to watch. This is an introduction to permaculture. Like she said, I'm Garrett Heator. I have an orchard and teach permaculture classes, and I'm also a middle school teacher for my day job. So this is a definition of permaculture that I like to use. it's not the original definition. The original definition was a permanent agriculture, as in permanently sustainable agriculture. And that was coined by two Australian men named Bill Mollison and David Holmgren and back in 1978. But this is a little bit more updated. It's from around the year 2000 or so by Toby Hemingway. And he defines it as an instructional manual for solving the challenges laid out by the new paradigm of meeting human needs while enhancing ecosystem health. So since the sort of creation of the concept of permaculture, it's evolved, it's grown over time to encompass more than just growing food, more than just agriculture, to become a fully sustainable culture, a fully permanently sustainable way of life. And one key difference or differentiator in this definition that I like is that there's a new paradigm that we're facing. The new paradigm is meeting human needs while enhancing ecosystem health. Throughout most of human history, if we look at the big picture, we haven't had the issue of needing to really have a permanently sustainable ecosystem or enhancing the ecosystem health. People lived in smaller tribes. If they did overuse the resources of an ecosystem, it was in a small area, they could move to another area and eventually settle into a place where they would have a more sustainable system. But with the global society, with the power of fossil fuels, with the advances of technology, with approaching 8 or 9 billion people on the planet, we no longer have the option of destroying ecosystems. They are the foundation of life. They're foundation of everything that supports us. They're the foundation of the economy. And with the way the economy is set up, that's often not accounted for. But that is going to be the new paradigm we have to face going forward, is that we need to meet our needs for the people that are here. We need to feed ourselves, house ourselves, meet the basic needs that we have, but also at the same time, enhance the ecosystem. And agriculture is still probably the lowest hanging fruit of the direct impact that we can have on that, just by taking everyday actions ourselves. But you see here on this slide, it's a big picture of human history based on our best guess from the archaeological and anthropological evidence. We've been around for a couple million years. What you would recognize as a modern human has been around for probably 100, 200,000 years or something like that. And out of this huge long span of history, we only see the industrial agriculture that feeds most people today. Well, actually, it doesn't feed most people, but it supplies anywhere from 20 to 50% of the food supply globally. And that's a very modern, very recent, very short-lived sort of experiment that we're living through, as well as having this high of a population and trying to support that high of a population that we have today. So this is a very new paradigm, a very new problem that we haven't had a lot of experience with as a species. These are a collection of graphs showing how that trend has accelerated at an exponential rate, sort of looking like a hockey stick going straight up with our population, with the use of fossil fuels, with the production of plastic, with our use of groundwater, with so many different things. You can see it's all accelerating at an exponential rate. And I don't think you need to be a fortune teller to understand that this can't continue. You cannot continue exponential growth on this graph going straight up with all these things. At some point, it needs to flatten out, or it will come down like a roller coaster. And one of the central goals of permaculture is to sort of soften that landing of how are we going to bring this curve down somewhat, or at least flatten it out and create some sort of stability that can move forward in a sustainable way. And ultimately, we want to move beyond sustainability, because being sustainable is just like, you can keep it going in theory. We want to move beyond being sustainable and into being regenerative, where we're creating excess, where we have resiliency built into our systems. And sustainability is just like a starting point, really, that we need to get to. And permaculture is a guidebook or a set of references or a design systems that can help guide us along that path. This is a quote that I really like that sort of sums this all up in a big picture kind of way. It's from an ecologist named E.O. Wilson. He says, "The real problem with humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And it's terrifically dangerous, and it's now approaching a point of crisis overall." So he's referring to what we just talked about. Basically, humans haven't evolved physically very much, if at all, for a couple 100,000 years. So Paleolithic emotions and physiology in our bodies, with these medieval institutions that are in place that sort of run society or organize society from the Roman Empire days. But yet we have this technology that, with atomic energy or atomic weapons or genetic engineering, where we can create life from nothing synthetically. It's like the power of gods, but we don't have that wisdom. We don't have that mythology. We don't have the spirituality to guide us really with this power. And that's one of the core problems that we're facing. And I don't think that permaculture can really deliver all of that, but I think it can be a good first step, a good like gateway towards that direction, to allow us to move that way, to gain the wisdom, to gain the understanding, to how do we steward this power, this responsibility that we've come into as humans. So this is a good sort of summary of permaculture in one slide. Well, it's made by David Holmgren, which was one of the co-creators of permaculture. He has a website where this is available for free for anyone. He also has a book that's really good called Retro Suburbia, about how to retrofit the suburbs to be sustainable. But it's all based around 3 core ethics, which is caring for the earth, caring for people, and having a fair share. So if there's a surplus of any resource, it's sent back into the system, or returning the surplus when there is a surplus, or like giving out dividends, or if there's excess nutrients, they're composted. Those are some examples of that, but those are the core ethics that you want to plan around. And then the design principles are sort of the guidelines that you use while you're creating design systems. The first one is observe and interact. And Bill Mollison, the other co-creator of permaculture, has a funny line where he said, someone asked him what his most important tool was when he goes to a consultation for a design. And he said it was his hammock, so that he could relax and really observe the site and the patterns of what was the wind direction, where was the slope, where was the wildlife moving. If you really sat still, relaxed, and tried not to think or judge as much, that was always the first step, to just observe nature. And then you can start to interact with it once you recognize patterns. And once you recognize the patterns of nature, you can use those patterns to catch and store energy, which is the second principle. This often looks like water storage, like when rainwater comes onto a landscape, you want to slow it down, spread it out, sink it into the landscape, rather than have it rush off in gullies where it can cause floods and erosion and all these problems. We want to catch that energy, store it, and spread it evenly. Obtain a yield. We need to regenerate ecosystems, but we also want to feed ourselves. Number 4 is apply self-regulation and feedback. So it's sort of like science, where you accept peer review, you regulate yourself, you take feedback, and it's a constantly evolving system of what the best practices are. Number 5, use and value renewable resources and services, produce no waste, design from patterns to details. That starts with the observation to actually understand the patterns of nature before you get into any details of what exactly you want to do. You want to understand the bigger picture of your region and the trends and things like that. Number 8, integrate rather than segregate. 9, use small and slow solutions. 10, use and value diversity. 11, use edges and value the marginal. And number 12 is creatively use and respond to change. This is another good graphic from Holmgren's website, also available for free if you're interested in checking out more of his stuff. This is the design flower, and this really represents in a visual way how it's a continual process. It's not like something you can just check off your box and you're like, well, I did permaculture, got that done. You're constantly reevaluating, reassessing, planning, designing around what you see happening. And you circle back to each of these areas over time. And these are just broad categories. And under each category, there's a whole list off to the side of all of these different rabbit holes that you can go down. And if you Google any one of these, there's a whole lot of information. There's entire books on each of these where you can learn. There's YouTube videos where you can learn more. But this is just a big picture of what permaculture can encompass, of some of the design applications of how we can use it to design our, not only our food system, but our buildings, our society, and our health and spiritual well-being, economics, finances, and ultimately our entire lives. So a lot of cool things in there, plenty to learn about, and a lot of different, this can show how diverse it can be. It doesn't just have to be, you know, gardening or big orchards or any of that. There's room for all types of different skills and abilities and diverse types of people to play a role. History of some of the literature. J. Russell Smith wrote a book, Tree Crops of Permanent Agriculture, 100 years ago, basically saying that there's all these advantages of tree crops, of sequestering carbon and building fertility and infiltrating water and not needing to replant every year, and a diversity of harvests from not just fruit and nuts, but also firewood or timber or building materials. And he was arguing that tree crops should be a basis of our agriculture back then. So he was pretty ahead of the curve, but he didn't really invent the word permaculture. But that is a core element of permaculture, is using tree crops. And then the two co-creators that I've been mentioning, Mollison and Holmgren, invented the word in 1978. Manasoba Fukuoka wrote One Straw Revolution in that same year. He doesn't call it permaculture, but it's the same thing, basically, of studying the patterns of nature, observing and interacting, not having the industrial reductionist mindset of trying to master and control nature, but rather getting into the flow with it and using nature to help you grow food. That's a really interesting book to read. It's really short and it's available for free online. And then the Permaculture Designer's Manual by Bill Mollison is sort of like the original guidebook. It's like an encyclopedia of all these different ideas sort of played out and drawn out. And then I have a list of some other notable authors and teachers who have books and YouTube videos, websites, blogs, all types of stuff. And that's not a comprehensive list by any means. It's just off the top of my head, some of the most influential authors and teachers who I've learned from. So my place now is, it's halfway between Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo. You can see kind of the tree rows from above. This was 3 years ago. I moved there 4 years ago, or 4.5 years ago, and 3 years ago planted 1,000 trees down in the field. And it was originally a hay field. I used what's called a single bottom plow behind a tractor, and it basically digs a little ditch and flips the sod over. So it makes a little ditch and a little mound, and that's known as a swale in permaculture. So these are like miniature swales that are built. The entire left side of the field is on contour. So it's all the water that would run down that hill there is spread out in each tree row and sunk into each tree row. And it also catches fertility because I grow crops in the alleyways. Sometimes I'll till once in a while in those alleys. And if there's any erosion from the tilling, that gets caught and stored in the tree row. And then also when I'm mowing the grass or the hay in those alleyways, that tends to run downhill. And so the little ditch is already starting to fill in just after a few years. By the time the trees are fully established, it'll probably be almost completely filled in, but it helps the trees because it's going to hold in a little more water. It makes little puddles in the ditch. So if we get, when the snow melts, it just holds on to water a little bit longer than if it were just running down the hill. So it helps the trees with that, and having the trees on a little mound keeps their roots from drowning in the water from the little ditch. So the trees are planted up a little bit higher so that if there's a flood or something, they'll be a little bit higher and their roots won't drown. So it's catching and storing that water and fertility and concentrating it on the trees that I want to ultimately be the crops. And it'll be like a U-pick orchard is the ultimate goal. It's not all fruit and nuts. There's a lot of diversity in there. There's, I think, 15 different species, and a few of them are just support trees like nitrogen fixers or trees for lumber or firewood, things like that. So that's the big picture, but I don't harvest a lot out of the orchard. Most of what I harvest is from smaller gardens that are up by the house, and you don't really need a whole bunch of land. There's 8 acres here overall, just to give you an idea of what the scale is, but you really don't need that to start growing your own food. And it's actually less return on investment as you scale up to like a commercial scale. You're going to get less ROI per acre or per square foot and per hour that you put into it. So the highest ROI activities, return on investment activities, like if you're thinking of, if you're doing an activity, how much are you paying yourself at an hourly rate? The highest ROI activities are also the most accessible. So anybody can get out and forage. You don't need to own land or glean excess. A lot of times orchards or farms will just let things drop for the deer for a lot of different reasons. If there's not a market, if they didn't spray and it didn't come clean, or if they don't want to hire harvesters, or if it's just a lot of times old orchards, they'll just let it go. So if you can find places that are just letting food go to the deer or wildlife, gleaning is a really good practice. And then if you do have a bit of land, then concentrating your effort in that and biointensive gardening methods can really provide a very high yield from a very small space. They've done some studies where they can provide a complete diet for a person in, I think it's 10,000 square feet, which is like 1/8 of an acre. That's really intensive, really specialty care, and it would be a really limited diet. I wouldn't advise you trying to grow a complete diet, but you could grow half or a good chunk of your food in a pretty small area just by having really good practices of how you tend to that small area. And then as we move up in scale into commercial scale, where you're having a market garden, or I would consider myself like a mid-sized food forest, where it's too much for me to harvest. So I would need to either hire labor or have some type of U-pick system where other people are going to come in there and harvest. It's less return on investment based on the hours and investment that I put into it than my foraging activities, which pay me back immediately, or my gardening activities up by the house, which feed us for a good chunk of the year. And then commercial agroforestry would be like Mark Shepard's scale. If you're not familiar with him, he's in Wisconsin. He has 110 acres of chestnuts, apples, grapes, raspberries, all types of perennial tree crops and bushes and vines. And then he, in the alleyways, similar to my setup, but on a bigger scale, in the alleyways, he'll graze pigs or cattle or sheep or chickens. And then he'll also grow alley crops like asparagus or sunflowers in between the tree rows. And so even though that's not as high of an ROI, it's still an important experiment, and it's still a very useful thing going forward if we can have more of our commercial farms shifting into something like agroforestry, where they're actually creating an ecosystem and getting off of their dependence on chemicals and plastics and fossil fuels, and becoming more self-sufficient and enhancing the ecosystem like we talked about in the beginning, while also feeding people at a commercial scale. That's a huge and important shift that we need more of, but not everybody needs to do that. And the easiest thing for most people to do is to just start feeding themselves some fruit and some veggies here and there where they can. This is an example of gleaning this orchard. The guy couldn't afford the pesticides that he normally uses, or the fungicides in this case, and the apples, a lot of his apples had some scabs on them. So he was just giving them away. So I got a truckload of apples I used for cider, some apple cider and some hard cider. And this stuff happens a lot in a lot of places. You'd be surprised how many abandoned orchards there are, or places that there's wild apple trees or wild pear trees, or chestnuts, or even blueberry farms. A lot of the time will not have enough labor to pick them all, and you can go pick blueberries for free if it's the right time and the right place. But I forage apples every year and probably get 50 or 100 pounds and just keep them in a sunroom that's not heated. And it's probably worth $500 to $1,000 worth of apples every year without needing to plant them or fertilize them or water them or keep the deer from eating them, or any of the work that goes into trying to grow your own. So that's why foraging is such a high value activity, because you skip all the work and just do the harvesting. These are some examples of the more bio-intensive gardens that I'm putting more time and effort into up by the house, but I'm also getting a much bigger harvest out of these than I am out of the extensive gardens down in the field. Because I don't go down in the field as much, it's not as useful for me to harvest a huge amount of stuff. I'm cooking dinner in a hurry and I just want to grab something. I go to these gardens, which are right outside the door, and end up eating a good chunk of our vegetables for probably 8 months out of the year, and then a bunch of squash and onions and stuff in the winter. And then progressively more and more fruit. More of our fruit will come from these gardens. The one on the left is this is after 1 year. It was grass before this. I just took a broad fork and aerated the grass because it was really compacted. Then I laid down cardboard and wood chips and let that age for a couple months. And then I just dug out rows in the wood chips and planted seed. And that's mostly perennials in there. There's blueberry bushes, goji berry bushes, black currant bushes. There's a magnolia tree that was already there that I just went around. And then chicory, burdock, salsify. There's some echinacea, asparagus in there. There's some plantain coming up as a volunteer that's edible and medicinal. A lot of dandelions are always good volunteers. Then on the right, this garden is 3 years old in this picture. So it's coming into a place where it's pretty much self-sufficient. There's no more weeding. I've used border plants. You can see in the front, there's daylilies. Those are edible daylilies, and they keep the grass from coming into the garden bed. And then I grow more vulnerable stuff in the center, like kohlrabi, kale, beets, chard. And then on the edges, I have more durable perennial stuff, like oregano. This one has some Turkish rocket, some chicory. And there's a few other things in there. There's a bunch of strawberries running around. Those make a nice, good ground cover to fill in any gaps. And bellflowers in there. There's a few other things in there that I'm forgetting, but really diverse, based around perennials in a permanent location that is designed to keep the grasses from running in. And ideally, you only add mulch in 1 year, but if you need to add spots of mulch from years going forward, you do that. And again, these are most of our vegetables for most of the year. There's some amaranth and sunflowers from those gardens as well. You can see how big they are. That's because they're really fertile. It's really well aerated. So when I do the broad fork, I'm breaking it up really well so that oxygen can get down in the soil, and that regenerates the microbial life and the mycelial networks down there in the soil. It also lets the roots grow easier. And then when I lay down the cardboard and wood chips, that kills the sod, which provides a ton of fertility and fertilizer. So you get these huge crops of things that would maybe normally be half this size, just from aeration and composting the sod and having good mulch. This is a community garden in Madison. I would love to see more of these in our towns and cities across West Michigan. They use a lot of really good practices here. They have a lot of perennials. They have a lot of beneficial plants that bring in beneficial insects that would be predators of whatever bugs might be eating your crops. They use a ton of mulch. So it's a community garden where hundreds of people are growing tons of food. Each person has like a small 5x10 or 10x10 patch, but you can grow tons of your own vegetables from that small space if you design it properly and you have good fertility. You'd be amazed what you can get out of this small of a space. And it also is a community split space for people to come together. It makes this park look beautiful, and it gives people an opportunity to bond over something meaningful for themselves and for the ecology. This is a look at the field. So when I flipped the sod over and made those miniature swales, I planted things because it was just bare dirt, and nature abhors a vacuum. So you want to plant as soon as you have bare dirt if you're doing something that's exposing it. And so I planted 25 different cover crops on the tree rows. And the purpose of these is to, one, keep the grass back, because grass is competitive to young trees, and the trees I'm planting are young saplings that are 1, 2, 3 foot tall. And so keeping the grass off of them is really beneficial to help them grow. A lot of professional orchards will just lay down a carpet of Roundup basically to keep the grass back, or they'll lay down a carpet of plastic, which the phthalates that releases into the soil get taken up in food, and then they're human endocrine disruptors. So the use of agriculture plastic is a really big issue for human health going forward. But I wanted to avoid using plastic, avoid using pesticides, but still have a way to keep the grass back from the trees. So planting cover crops is a good way to do that. Then you also get a yield out of it. You get some type of harvest, and you also create ecosystems where bees and all types of pollinators are just going crazy on this oregano. On the left picture, those 2 rows are both oregano. So it's feeding tons of pollinators. It gives me the option if I ever wanted to harvest it. I've got 2 200-foot rows of oregano. I haven't taken the time to actually harvest it and take it to a farmer's market or anything because I'm really busy, and it's not a very high, it wouldn't be a very high ROI because the labor time to pick it and drive there and get a booth just doesn't add up. But I do harvest the seed off that oregano, and then I use that to plant other beds or sell some of the seed. And on the right is echinacea, purple coneflower, which is another native that's good for pollinators. The butterflies love it. And you see a bunch of goldenrod coming up too. I didn't plant the goldenrod, but it's a volunteer that shows up that again is great for pollinators, and it's also a good herbal tea. So I harvest some of it for tea, but mostly I just let it hold the grass back and feed the pollinators and do its thing out there. So this is extensive. Like, I'm not weeding out here, I'm not watering out here, I'm not doing any work. It's just I flipped over the sod, threw out the seed, and did a rain dance and hoped that it all came. So there's a lot of rows where the cover crops didn't take off and take back the grass as well. These 2 have held up the best probably as far as the germination rate, being able to stand up to drought and being able to hold back the grass for indefinitely. It's been 4 years now, and these are still keeping the grass completely out. But there's a lot of other rows where the grass has come in, and it's okay. It's just going to slow down the growth rate on my trees, but as long as the trees get up above it, they should be fine mostly. But it's ideally, if you're doing something at a medium scale or commercial scale like this, you get a good cover crop that will last for decades until it's shaded out by the trees. Some gardening best practices, just in general, you want to start with doing a zone and sector analysis. Zones are like what I've been describing this whole time, where right outside my doorstep is zone 1. Down in the field is zone 3 or 4. You want to start in your zone 1, which is the next step. Start at the doorstep. Start wherever you're going to walk by the most often and wherever is the most accessible to you, because we're always in a hurry. And I don't go down in the field just because it's an extra walk down a hill to harvest that oregano. I go to the patch that's right outside my door. So planning on how much work you're going to put in and how much harvesting you're going to do based on the zone of where it's at. Sectors mean the flow of things through the area. So like wind, pollution, water, wildlife, humans, where do things flow through the area, and mapping that out. A lot of times permaculture designers will have different maps that can overlay. So they might have one map of the site that just show the zones and to differentiate between those, another map that showed the sectors, and then a third map that show the contours, and then a fourth map that show how those could all interplay to create forest gardens or ponds or whatever the goal is for the site. So start with the zone and sector analysis, analyzing your site. Start close to your door. Just do one patch at a time. Those main gardens by the house, I usually do just one per year, 1 or 2 per year. And I've got like 6 of them now, and they just maintain themselves. They are based in tree crops or perennials. So they have berry bushes, they have trees like landscape trees or food trees built into them. And then they have perennial fortress plants. And there's just patches, small patches in them for my annual crops that I maintain a little bit, but once I get it going and established, it's pretty much self-maintaining. So it's like an investment that pays you back every year. Having diverse polyculture plantings. Poly means many. Culture is like to cultivate. So polyculture means having many diverse plants. So like you see the pictures of my gardens, it's not just a row of beans and a row of onions and everything is isolated and organized. It's sort of all mixed together, more like how a field or meadow or a forest would be, because polyculture plantings is how nature does it, and nature's better at it than when we try to take over. So the benefits are, and from all the research supporting polyculture, are that it increases fertility, it increases water infiltration, it increases the soil microbial life network, it increases resistance to pests and diseases. It increases a lot of times the actual nutrient profiles of the plants. They found plants that are grown in no-till plantings like these, where the land isn't tilled, have higher levels of antioxidants and nutrients than the same plant grown in a patch that was tilled up without any polyculture plantings, has a lower nutrient profile. Using organic mulches. So I just try to get wood chips from tree trimmers. A lot of times they need a place to dump their wood chips. So I call all the tree trimmers around me and just say, if you have a load of wood chips anytime in the next few months, come and dump it here. And then spread those out onto the gardens as I need it. Keep it aerated. So you notice I have stepping stones in that garden that was too wide to reach into. You want to design the size so that you're never stepping on the growing area, either having pathways or stepping stones, or just smaller like raised beds that you can reach from either side into. You don't want to be stepping into where it's growing because that causes compaction. You don't want to be driving a tractor over it because that causes compaction. And when you first plant it, if it was a lawn, you need to break it up somehow. Well, you don't need to. You could wait and let the plants break it up, but you would see lower yields for the first few years. So if you can physically get in there with the broad fork or do a double dig with a shovel, something to get a couple feet deep and really aerate it, that really helps speed the growth up. If you're not physically able or don't have the time or don't want to put in the work, the plants can aerate it for you, but it just takes a little while longer, and you won't get as much of a harvest over the first year or two. Fortress plants, like I showed you in the pictures, perennial plants that can hold up to grass and keep it from running into the bed. So I try to surround like a wall or fortress around all the main gardens that I have up by the house so that the grass doesn't come in. And then edible ornamentals, also known as edimentals, just to make it look beautiful. You want lots of different flowering plants that flower at different times of the year, both for pollinators, but also for the look of it. And you're going to be less likely to have, if you live in this township or a suburb, have the neighbors call the HOA or whatever, a township board, or try to turn you in for having an unruly yard if it looks beautiful, or there's some type of pattern of organization, some type of lines delineated, and the plants look like they're ornamental plants. There's a lot of plants that overlap that are both edible and ornamental, like the daylilies in that one garden. Anyone will recognize those. They look like a landscaping plant, but if you get certain varieties, you can also eat them. That's one example. There's dozens of them, but just making it look nice. It makes it more enjoyable for you and the family, and it also makes it more interesting and presentable to people who aren't familiar with this. So that's the presentation. I also make herbal remedies. Those are available on my website. I don't go to the farmer's market anymore since COVID, but I might go again at some point in the future. No plans to at the moment. And I also have a plant sale every spring and fall. I sell a lot of bare root, berry bushes, fruit trees, nut trees, and a lot of the perennials, like the edible perennials that are the basis of a lot of my main gardens. So I have a listing out for the plant sale now. And I also have weekend-long permaculture design classes coming up, May 7th and 8th, and May 14th and 15th, that are at the farm. So you can check all this out in person if you're interested and do a deeper dive into all this stuff. I have a blog. The shop is where the herbal remedies and stuff are. And it's also, there's a sign up link at the shop website for the design classes. And then the tree sale and the plant sale are listed on Facebook at Trees and Teas and Instagram, or you can just send me an email if you're interested, and I can send you a list of what all I have available. And I think that we will open it up to the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Garrett. That was fantastic. I know I got really excited about planting more, and it started out with those principles, and I thought, man, those can really look overwhelming, but you did an excellent job of breaking down little bite-sized steps that we can all take. So I really appreciate that. Makes it so much more accessible. And with that, I'll go to the Q&A first. So actually, I did see one come through the chat. David and Carol asked, how close are the trees planted? And I think they might have been referencing your tree orchard.
Yeah, there's trade-offs to that. And then it's the same in professional orchards. There's different trade-offs to how tightly they plant the trees. I went with about 6 foot in between trees. A lot of times, if you're doing it like I am and not taking care of them at all with any irrigation or weeding or fertilizer or fencing, you're going to have more of a loss. More of the trees are going to die. More will get browsed by deer. And so you want to plant them tighter in anticipation of that. But then my plan eventually is to have them too tight to where eventually I'll trim out the ones that either don't have as good of fruit, don't have as good of nuts, or have died, or have some more disease susceptibility. So some of the upper rows where they're more berry bushes that are smaller, those could maybe stay at that 6 foot spacing and just look like a hedgerow. But then the bigger tree rows, like the chestnuts and the persimmons and the big trees like that, will need to be thinned out if most of them make it to production size. I would cut them probably 1/3 to 1/2 of those down eventually for lumber or firewood, or to inoculate with mushrooms or something like that.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that information. And then Jane asked, what did you use to aerate the existing grass prior to laying down the cardboard?
It's called a broad fork. And it's basically like a pitchfork, but super heavy duty. I got mine from a website called Meadow Creature. And it's just a big pitchfork that you can jump onto so that you can get it forced down to really compacted turf. It's a pretty good workout, but it's better than most gardening workouts where you're like, your back hurts from being hunched over in an awkward position. Using a broad fork is more like going to the gym. Like you're lifting a heavy thing and then you're jumping up and down on it, which is good exercise. And so yeah, I use that, but you can also just use a shovel and look up the double dig method. That works too. That's also a lot of work, but if you're good with a shovel, it's pretty manageable.
Good deal. And is that just something you did one time, or have you ever had to do that in between your growing spaces afterwards?
Yeah, I've just done it once for each of my main gardens. When it's just grass, I mow the grass real short. I go through and break it up with a broad fork. Then I put down cardboard. Then I put down wood chips. And that's it. That's all I do for aeration. Other than that, just don't step on it. Don't drive on it. And the polyculture plantings will keep it well aerated over time, as long as you're not doing something to push it down.
Sure. Great. And then Cindy asked, where did you get your bulk seed for oregano, coneflowers, and goldenrod?
The goldenrod just volunteered and showed up. So I didn't buy any seed for that. The echinacea and oregano I got from a website. I think it was called Todd's Seeds. I'm not positive because it was a few years ago, but it was like 1 pound bags for $50 or something, I want to say. So I bought a few of those and spread them out. But like I said, I tried like 25 different things. So I also had a whole bunch of other stuff out there that didn't take as well or didn't last as well, or there were annuals, like traditional cover crops that I used that lasted for 1 year. Like I had a row of oats, I had another row of buckwheat. So those both kept the grass back for 1 year, but then they didn't reseed themselves because those are annuals. So I tried all kinds of stuff. Those two have just held up the best.
Good deal. Thank you. Heather asked, she says, I think she's referring to planting on fill sites with contaminated soils. So that's the context. And then her question is, can the tree fruit be eaten safely? If not right away, about how many years would it be safe after?
I'm not sure about that. I know that nuts have more of a placental-like barrier between the environmental pollution and the actual nut itself. So I would say nuts would be a safer bet in general, but I think trees would be fine too. I guess it would depend on what type of contamination, and I'm not sure. I know there's a lot of mycoremediation using mycelium to remediate contamination, or just building raised beds and bringing in new soil on top of that might be a good approach. But yeah, I can't say for sure.
Sounds good. Thank you for speaking to that anyways, though. It's helpful to have some things to look up, at least somewhere to get started.
Yeah.
Michael seems to be having issues with deer. He says, when I plant anything like this, it is mostly destroyed. Do you have any deer? And if so, I'm guessing, what are some tips?
I do have deer, but it's not too bad. There's a lot of hunters by me, so they get culled pretty heavily every fall. So it's not like a herd of 50 or 100 are coming through. Usually it's just a few. And they have caused some damage, but not too bad. So if you have like a whole herd coming through and they're living there regularly, you're gonna have to protect everything. Fencing, or if it's an individual tree, putting some type of cage around it, or they have like light machines or sound machines that can try to scare them off. Not sure how your neighbors will feel about that stuff, but dogs and cats actually can help sometimes if you have dogs or cats in the yard. Planting right outside your doorstep is a good place to start. Like the deer don't come up to those gardens that are by my house because they have the whole field. So they just don't mess with it up there. But you might have heavier pressure than that, and you might just need to put up fencing. One other thing I did do in the field was the first year that I planted all those trees, it was I had a lot of deer that winter, and so I cut down a live red maple out of the woods that's down by the end of the field, and try to bait them away from the young trees, basically, because like they're coming through and eating the young tree buds through the field that I just planted. If I cut down this big one and it's out in the open where they feel safe, like on the edge of the woods, and it's at like their face level, my goal was to get them to eat this like tree bud buffet as a distraction. And then I ended up cutting it up for firewood, so I used it anyways. But that's one thing. But if you have too many of them, you just need to physically keep them out sometimes.
Sure. Yeah, that was all very helpful. Thank you. And Heather asks, what is your website for all of this info on the plant sale? Which I think you've got up, it's under shop, right?
So the plant sale is not on the shop.
Okay.
The the platform I'm using for that website only allows me to list 10 things, and I have like 40 different plants or something. So I just have a list on Facebook. I posted it to the Van Cal Permaculture group, and I posted it to my Facebook and Instagram pages. If you can't find it on there, or you don't want to get on there, you can just email me and I'll send you a list.
Awesome, thank you. I've been typing out some of these just so that folks have them in writing too. And then Jacob asks, which tree species are in your orchards?
Oh, a lot. There's persimmon, pawpaw, butternut, chestnut, black locust, honey locust, mulberry, seaberry, hazelnuts, aronia berries, apricots, June berries. I can't remember if I said aronia berries, elderberries, honeyberries. That's most of them. There might be a couple I'm forgetting.
That's quite the list. That's awesome. And then Jane asked, Jane just wanted to let us know that meadow creature broad forks are also available from A.M. Leonard. Just to share with the group, which is helpful. Thanks, Jane. I'm really glad that you put up information about your permaculture design classes. I wanted to ask, are these classes for beginners? Are they for intermediate folks? Is there any sort of entry level like reading or videos? You know, I mean, how much do we need to know before we can do classes like that?
Yeah, I would say anybody could come. It's good for beginners to intermediate, probably. If you already have a permaculture design course, you probably have already covered a lot of it, but you may benefit just from seeing things in practice, because a lot of times people that take a permaculture design course, it'll be entirely in a classroom and you don't get to see a lot of it, or even it might even be all online. And so just seeing it in person can help a lot of people. So definitely good for beginners, people who have no experience, good for intermediate level, and then may also be helpful for some people who have more experience with permaculture but want to see it more in person.
Awesome. Thank you. That's very helpful. Well, good. Well, I am not seeing any other questions come in, so I've got a quick couple things to say as a wrap up. But if you do have other questions while I'm talking, feel free to send them in, or Garrett has had his email up here as well. You can reach him there or on his social media. So be sure to take that down. And again, just as a reminder, these are going to be recorded. So if you can't find your, scrap piece of paper that you wrote this down on, it'll be up on YouTube to find in the coming weeks as well. So I'm going to go ahead and just switch our screens really quick there as we wrap up. And once again, thank you, Garrett, for being with us today. It was a really fantastic presentation and we learned so much. I know I took a lot of notes and I'm excited to get some of this integrated on my own property this year. So thank you again, and thank you for making yourself available for questions and just for folks to reach out and continue learning from you.
Awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm happy to talk about it anytime.
Thank you. And thank you everyone who attended today. We really do appreciate your time learning about permaculture and any of the other topics that you attended this week. Again, you can message us using our contact form on our website at vanburencd.org/contact-2/, or you can sign up for our monthly newsletter using the subscribe option at the bottom of our website. This webinar, like I said, is being recorded. They will be available on our YouTube page next week or the week after. That's youtube.com/user/vanburencd/videos. Again, you can follow us on Facebook as well, and we are on Instagram now. So at Van Buren CD for Facebook and at VBCDMI on Instagram. Thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you all in the future. Happy planting.